Hello and welcome to the Getting There Show, where we speak with brilliant people and unpack the key influences and decisions that have helped them get to where they are today. You'll get the books, the mental models, the inspirations, and all the steps in their journey to help guide you on your own path. As Isaac Newton said, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." Today's giant is a fantastic business leader called Katharina Lueth, who after several years at McKinsey and armed with an MBA from IESE, is now VP of Europe, Managing Director for Raisin DS, a successful Fintech company in Germany, who offer their marketplace of savings and investment products across Europe and in the United States. This episode is packed full of insights for those interested in strategy consulting, breaking into tech, and for those keen to understand more about fintech and the opportunities it offers for business school graduates. Katharina shows her clear passion for her work and also gives recommendations on the power of positive psychology for both happiness and productivity. As always, we make sure to include all of Katharina's toolkit and influences in the show notes, so as to maximize the chances that this show helps you get to where you want to get to. Hello, Katharina. How are you doing?
Very good. Thank you, Frederick. How are you?
Very, very well, thanks. Thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Yeah. We'll probably have to let the audience know that you have your daughter strapped to you, so that's why you're moving up and down to keep her asleep.
Exactly. So I hope nobody gets seasick, and I'm optimistic we'll manage to keep her asleep all the way through.
Excellent. Well, that's the definition of true multitasking.
I'll do my best.
And where are you based at the moment?
I'm based in Berlin, actually.
Okay, cool. And that's where Raisin is headquartered, right?
Yes, exactly. So we're headquartered in Berlin, but have actually quite a few locations by now. So Hamburg is a very big one since our merger with DS, so Raisin DS. We've got the bank, Raisin Bank, sitting in Frankfurt, and we also have people sitting in the States, in Manchester, in Madrid. So we're quite global by now.
Oh, excellent. Well, I'm really looking forward to digging a bit deeper into what Raisin does and your role there. But first, it would be really great just to get a sense of your journey so far. So one of the first questions I like to ask is, what has been your journey to date? Because I think you've had a really interesting, you've got a really interesting background.
Yeah. So let's maybe start off at my undergrad and leave the part before that behind. So in undergrad, I did a fairly classic business degree. But I did do a bilingual or sort of dual degree, however. So I spent half of the time in Germany and then half of the time in the States and Mexico. And it's a fairly specific concept of university that I went to. I'm not sure how common it is outside of Germany. So it's called a University of Applied Sciences. Mm-hmm. So basically during the 4 years of undergrad, what you do is you spend 3 years at university and then 2 6-month stints in internships. So it's integral part of the actual studies that you do 6-month internships twice. And so I did that at the beginning and did my internships at Porsche for the first one, and then Scotia Capital, so a bank in New York. And then after that joined consulting, so fairly classic career path there. And then as part of the consulting program, I did an MBA at IESE in Barcelona from 2008 to 2010. So I was lucky in a sense because I was specialized in financial services. So I basically set out the financial crisis in academia. So that was lucky timing. I want to say it was planned that way, but it really wasn't. But a week after I started my MBA, Lehman went bust. So quite good timing. And after my MBA, went back into consulting, so back to McKinsey for another couple of years, again, focusing largely on financial services and a little bit on economic development as well. And then, 2014, I decided my time in consulting was coming to an end, as so many people do. And was lucky in a sense that I got into Fintech in what I would still call fairly early days. So it wasn't, the very, very early, but still, I would say a bit earlier than where we're at now, and joined Raisin or Raisin DS at their Series A funding. So more or less in terms of timing, and spent the past, 7.5 years by now, basically building the international business there. So first building the Raisin.com platform, and then expanding into other European markets, so Spain, Netherlands, Ireland, France, and by now also running the UK business. So at the moment, I'm actually currently on a maternity leave due to this little one here, but we'll be back in the saddle in the new year, basically.
Fantastic. And what does Raisin do?
So Raisin DS is a marketplace for savings and investments. So the initial core product of what we do is basically a marketplace for savings products. So what you do is you do your KYC, so identification for a bank account once. And then similar to what you would do with stock trading, you have one single account, and from there you can open savings accounts at multiple banks that offer you a bit higher interest rates on your savings. What we also do is investment and pension products. So we have a very competitive ETF-based portfolios of investment products. We also have an ETF configurator by now for those who want to build their own portfolios, and also have pension products. The investment and pension products is Germany only at this point. And we do have both a B2C, so a direct to consumer proposition, as well as a B2B proposition. So we're also integrated via API or open banking, or however you want to call it, into the online banking of other players. And this can go basically from the neobanks such as N26 all the way to Deutsche Bank. So it can be a variety of players. Our core market, or sort of initial market, was Germany, but we're accessible from the entire European Union, as well as the UK, and also our most recent business is our US business as well.
Interesting. One of the things that I read about Raisin is the fact that you started with savings, right? Like that was your first product, and then since then you sort of expanded into other financial products. That's a really nice example of a sort of wedge strategy where you look at a big market and you focus first on becoming the sort of best player in a smaller niche within that market. Has that strategy worked quite well for you?
Yes, it's worked really well for us because especially when you look at Germany, Germany is a market of savers, not investors traditionally. Mm-hmm. So everyone's been trying to get people into investing and trading. And more recently, we're seeing a bit more success. But if you look at it, there's basically a lot of people have a lot of their money in savings products. So it's a great entry-level product to have customers join. Mm-hmm. And it's also, looking at it for a second, so since we're marketplace, we have two customers. It's also something where we don't just solve the customers or the consumer's problem in the sense of providing them access to higher interest rates, but it's also something where we're really helping banks with their liquidity management. So be it that they're either looking for additional liquidity or that they want to get rid of excess liquidity. So from that standpoint, it's a really good product to start with, because you're creating a win-win-win for everyone. And then moving into investment products from there is just a very natural progression.
Interesting. And in terms of the sort of future scope for product innovation, like, do you have plans to expand your portfolio further?
I can't go into any specifics, but yes, the idea is to expand further, but we are a savings and investment company. So we really are focusing on that side of things. So you're unlikely to see us offering mortgages anytime soon.
Sure. And I'd like to dive a little bit into your role and your experience at McKinsey, because what I'm seeing in the market is a lot of people still want to get into strategy consulting, and they're using that as a sort of springboard to join tech companies like Raisin. So, do you think that your experience at McKinsey was a really good foundation for your current role?
Yes, definitely. So I think consulting or strategy consulting is obviously a very intense learning experience. So you see a lot more companies and problems and challenges in a fairly short period of time versus what you might see in sort of, let's say, a classic corporate career. Again, it depends a little bit on where you're at, of course. And so it does give you that huge advantage of just also having a certain school of structured thinking and way of thinking and structuring things that's really helpful. I think the one big change or the one thing to be aware of is in strategy consulting, it's obviously a bit more theoretical, so to speak. So you come up with the strategy, and again, it's changing by now also in consulting, but typically you spend not quite as much time on implementing. And from my past couple of years, I can tell you, implementing is sort of is the key challenge sometimes. Even when you used to think coming up with the strategy is the hard part, but then you need to execute it, which is where you then end up finding all those fun obstacles of, this is how it was going to work in theory, but it just really doesn't. So you need to readjust. And the other thing I do think people need to keep in mind when they switch from strategy consulting into particularly startups, so it changes a little bit when they're larger scaled, is in consulting you have this fantastic back office and support system, right? You have people that are doing your slides, you have team assistants, you have a research team. So you have this entire support system, so to speak, whereas when you go into startup life, it's really a lot more hands-on, rolling up your sleeves, digging in there and just doing stuff yourself, right? So I do my own agenda setting, I do my own travel booking. So all of these things tend to be something that you just need to be aware of. So because it's quite different from what you might be used to. Also, the way you spend money is probably quite different. There's no business class tickets involved in startup life usually.
Sure. And do you think that fintech is still a really, really exciting place to be? Like, if you were in business school again, would you consider fintech as a great next step?
Yes, definitely. And I think in a certain sense, it might even be slightly easier for grad students to get into fintech nowadays. So when I joined, a lot of the companies that are big right now were just starting off, right? So there was 20 people in those companies. So the N26s, Revoluts, Raisin DS, all of us were starting off back then. So it was teams of, 20, maybe 50 people. And when you say 20, 50 people, it means at least half of them are engineers or somewhat related in the tech side of things, which for the classical grad student is not an area you can create a lot of value, let's say, unless you really have that engineering or software development background. So the number of actual MBA positions is actually quite limited in the earlier stage companies, because you have your sort of co-founding teams and C-level, but that tends to be very few people. And, they hire once or twice in their first sort of 2 or 3 years to get that executive team together. But then after that, there's not that many MBA students that you're going to hire into it, right? And now where we're at, you can see a lot of those fintechs having become a lot more mature, having a couple of hundred employees. So now there's a lot more actual positions available for grad students than in those very early days. Although obviously joining at a later stage of growth has its advantages and disadvantages, right? So I think one of the very amazing things that I really liked to see was seeing Raisin DS go from when I joined, we were 20, and now we're over 600 people. So that's quite an exciting journey to be a part of, obviously.
Absolutely. And what is it about fintech that you think makes it still so exciting?
So, I mean, banking or financial services as such is a huge industry, right? And I think there still is a lot of room for disruption, basically. So I think COVID actually, so one of the few positive sides of COVID, has given that extra push to people of going online. So you're now seeing an entire new customer segment that has done that jump into online, which I think is quite exciting, because before that, you kept trying to push people online, but there was a portion of consumers that was online and there was a portion that just wasn't. And of those that weren't online, we've seen quite a big push due to that disruption. But I do believe there's still such huge potential for services that can be improved, for transparency that can be created. Embedded finance right now is a bit the buzzword of the moment. So basically embedding financial services and products, not so much as a purpose in themselves, but embedding them where the consumer needs it. So buy now, pay later is a big buzzword. So this is when, an Amazon or wherever else you have that button of, I want to buy this, but pay it in 5 installments or 10 installments, things like that. So really bringing finance to the consumer where they need it, because most people don't say, I want banking, right? But people want to buy a house, save for their retirement, buy a new TV. So I think that's still very exciting. And there's still a lot of room for creating more transparency and better products for consumers.
And if you were offering advice to business school students in terms of helping them land sort of non-tech roles in fintech organizations, like what would you say to them?
So what obviously does help in fintech, what helps if you know a little bit about either fin or tech, or ideally both. So it really does help to have a reasonable understanding of financial services and how they work. So your classic finance classes or capital markets classes or what have me not in grad school, I do think is helpful. The other thing that is extremely helpful, it can obviously all be learned. So I didn't know a lot about digital marketing or software development when I joined Raisin DS, but anything that you can learn about all things online, so to speak. So how does online marketing work? What's cost per click, and how do those channels work? So anything where you can gain experience there or have a reasonable understanding of just technology, right? So I would encourage everyone to learn a little bit of programming. This doesn't mean that you're ever going to write a single line of code, but it just helps if you have a little bit of that understanding of what's half of the organization doing, right? So most fintechs will have 50+% of the organization working on the tech side of things. So it just helps if you have at least a basic understanding of what that is about, I would say.
Fantastic. That's why Exactimo exists, by the way, is to deliver, practical intensive courses at business schools to help students get digital fast. So my next question is around influential books. So is there a particular book that has sort of guided you in your journey or helped you with your role at Raisin DS?
Yeah, so I must admit, I'm not a huge reader of business or nonfiction books, but there is one book that I personally very much enjoyed and that I thought was very helpful, although not from a, let's say, sort of learning content as such, but it's called Authentic Happiness by Martin Seligman. So he's one of the key people in what they call positive psychology. So when you hear about psychology, it's often about, fixing your depression or what have me not. And what this book is all about is basically, yes, some of us are wired to be more optimistic than others. So there is a certain hard wiring, but you can ultimately cheat your brain in a certain sense into being slightly more optimistic. And there's just also quite a few techniques and little tricks and ways to think about things in there that I find really helpful. So just one example is practicing gratitude. So you might have heard of, 5-minute journals, where basically you spend 5 minutes at the morning and in the evening just thinking about what are 3 things that I'm grateful for and what are 3 good things that happened to me today. Because sometimes we have and this is a classic consulting thing, by the way, you have that laser focus on the 25 things that went wrong and that could go better. And especially in sort of young and growing organizations, you always tend to think of, what are all the things we need to do better and more of, and to just sort of refocus yourself and think, okay, what's the 3 things that happened today that were actually really good? And that helps you go to bed, so to speak, with a slightly more optimistic mindset rather than just thinking about the negatives. And so I felt that book was quite useful for that.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. I'm always amazed at reading how plastic the brain is in terms of you have control over how your brain gets wired, and practicing gratitude is just a really, really nice way to sort of rewire it around positivity, which again I think will help with productivity. And what about a quote, Katharina? I'm always intrigued by seeing whether there are certain quotes that help business leaders do their jobs more effectively.
Yeah. So this one's, I'll say it in German first, and then I'll try to translate it. And I have no idea where it comes from. You find it a lot on cups and T-shirts and stuff like that. So it's called "Get up, readjust your crown, and keep walking." So it's really about, again, resilience in a certain sense. So it's about, you will fall for sure, and especially in earlier stage companies, but also in scale-ups, stuff goes wrong, right? And stuff doesn't work as you planned it all the time. That's a given. So it's 2 steps forward and 1 back. And it's about that, again, mindset of let's not dwell on, so yes, let's find out what went wrong and why, but let's not dwell on whose fault it is, but let's rather, get back up, shake it off and keep going and keep trying, because it really is such an iterative process to get where you want to get. And I really believe in, yes, give yourself that 1 hour or sometimes that 1 day. So for me, that was, for example, the case during COVID, right? Then, your daycare center tells you we're closing again for who knows how long, right? And then you become extremely frustrated, right? You're like, okay, again. And we've cut down all our contacts already to the minimum. So you feel it's not even, it's not due to us running around, but, daycare is closing. What can you do about it? So, take a day to feel sorry for yourself, but then next morning, get up and fix the problem, right? You can keep feeling sorry for yourself for the next 10 weeks, but it's not going to help you in any way whatsoever other than have you be depressed. So, yeah.
And I guess that's particularly important for, startups and scale-ups where the journey isn't linear. It's sometimes up, it's sometimes down. And having that sort of positive mindset helps navigate that uncertainty.
Yeah, I think it's not just startups and scale-ups. I think it's life in general, to be honest.
True. And then my last question, Katharina, is around interview questions. So our audience are mainly business school students who are thinking about their next steps. So interviews are obviously an incredibly important part of that process. So what is your favorite interview question that you like to ask? And then, how would you yourself answer that question?
Yeah. So I must say my absolute favorite question that I ask everyone from sort of intern to senior manager I'm hiring is, what are you passionate about? Mm-hmm. And admittedly, to me, it's not even about, you can be passionate about everything or anything. It doesn't really matter to me. What I want to see is, do you get that glow from people? Do they have that spark of being really excited about something, right? And it could be chess or running a marathon, or I don't know, having climbed whatever mountain. It doesn't matter. For me, it's about that. Do I see the excitement when they talk to me about that passion. And for me personally, I would say it's two. So one's my family, so which I think is a bit the standard answer. But I do have two wonderful young daughters, and it just is very exhausting. But it provides just so much, so many moments every day where they make you laugh, and which just is such an enriching experience. And for me personally, one of the other things I'm very passionate about is Mexico as a country. So I was lucky enough to spend some time there. And for me, it's from the language, the food, the people, the place itself is something I just really, really enjoy and keep going back to. And it's a nice counterpart to our classic Germanness, as to every now and again emerge in that sort of Latin culture, I must say. So that for me would be the answer to that question.
That's a great answer. Funnily enough, I was reading an article in The Economist last week about the sort of fintech market in Latin America, and it seems like that's going to be the next place to get disrupted. So who knows? Maybe Raisin DS might open up a Mexican office, which will make you very happy.
Yeah, I mean, it's extreme. It's an extremely exciting market because in all of Latin America you have a huge unbanked population. So there's huge potential there for sure. Yeah.
Well, that's sort of my questions. We do have a few questions from our community, and we've got 3 actually. It'll be great if you could answer them. So the first one comes from Marcus, and he says, "How does open banking drive possibilities and incentives for an unconflicted business model between bank and customer, where banking products could be transparent and aligned to consumers?"
Yeah, so I think it's in general, I would say there's 2 things, right? So one, technology and cheaper technology and delivering services digitally just allows for cost savings. So bringing products to consumers in a more cost efficient manner. And the second thing I would say is about transparency, right? So you have a lot of those apps that allow for consolidation of different banking products. So how can you provide better transparency about the cost of consumer products? But also how can you give best-in-class products to consumers, right? So people are talking a lot about super apps, etc. But open banking basically allows you to very easily integrate external products into your own banking product, and that allows you to go more for best-in-class products rather than building them yourself, right? So this is something that people will expect to see a lot more, and this is something that should ultimately also help consumers get either more cost-efficient products or better products, basically. And there's also a lot of potential, obviously, in data and big data in making sure the right product gets offered to the right consumer.
And then the next question is around McKinsey. So Mehul says, "What are your top tips for getting into McKinsey?"
Yeah, so it's I've been getting that question since 2006, basically, and I think it's a bit of a tricky answer because, in a sense, sort of yes, there's case study interviews, right? And every business school student knows that. And yes, you should practice case interviews because it's just a bit helpful if you've seen that style of interview before, because it's a bit different from what you would usually see. On the other hand, you can practice them too much, right? So sometimes what I've seen is that there's a tendency from people who practice case studies till they drop, that they learn a lot of frameworks and then they apply frameworks that half the time don't really work with the case, because case studies are not about applying frameworks, but are about thinking in a structured manner. And to a certain extent, yes, you can practice that, but again, it's about, how elastic is your brain. So if you're an extremely creative person, maybe then sort of that structured way of thinking of consulting is trickier or more difficult to learn. And the second thing is, obviously, it's your entire CV that they look at, right? So do you have a good academic record? What's the stuff you've done before? By now, there's a lot more, let's say, 2 trains in strategy consulting. So one's the classic, let's say, a graduate student joining as an associate, but more and more, especially in the digital field, you also have sort of expert consultants, which basically requires you to be an expert in a specific field, right? So if you're a UI UX expert, that might be fantastic, because I'm sure a lot of the consultancies by now are looking for it. They all have their digital labs, and they're obviously consulting corporate clients a lot around digitization. So having a very specific experience, or if you've done 10 years in optimizing operations, that could also be fantastic. So I would say the unfortunate thing is there's not that one answer, right? So I can't tell you this is the 3 things you need to get on your CV and the 2 internships you need to do. I do believe the requirement still is, or tends to be, a fairly decent GMAT and or academic record. But other than that, there's multiple ways nowadays.
I think that answer will be really, really useful for Mehul and for anyone else that's listening. So thanks very much for that. And our last question is from Uzair, and he wants to ask more specifically about Raisin DS. Mm-hmm. And his question is, in Europe, with a negative interest rate environment, there is an incentive for banks to offer their clients alternative deposit products via Raisin DS. But do you think this model is viable in other regions where interest rates are not negative? And then secondly, does the marketplace or variety itself offer a compelling value proposition to the user?
Yeah, so I would say the answer is yes to both. So I think what's more important than the actual level of interest rates is that there is a spread. Mm-hmm. And typically in any market, you'll see a spread in interest rates between the incumbent banks that tend to have a huge amount of retail clients. Sorry, I need to start moving a bit. A huge amount of retail clients, and hence a huge number of deposits typically. So they tend to be deposit heavy. And then you have more specialized players, or, the consumer finance players that are basically able to offer you higher interest rates. And so bringing those 2 together is something that I do believe will make sense also in a rising rate environment. We would actually love rates to rise a bit, because we're reaching that point where a lot of people are wondering, should I even move money from my current account? Is it even worth it? What's the difference between 0 and 0.5%, so to speak? And the second part of the question was, is the marketplace proposition attractive in itself? Yes, for sure. Because in particular, if you're a bit more affluent, or if you are always on the lookout for the best rates, there is a huge proposition in not having to switch your core provider all the time, but rather saying, I'm going to log into my Raisin DS account, and then I just buy, so to speak, the next savings product that I like today, rather than having to shop around and say, today I'm with Bank A, and then tomorrow Bank B offers the best, so I need to KYC again, so go through the identification. Thank goodness that's online nowadays, but it's still a bit of a hassle. And then I need to close the account on the other side. So, and then for more affluent people, if you want to spread across multiple banks, it's even more compelling, because you have one place where you can manage your money rather than having to manage 5 online banking accounts in parallel.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Katharina, for joining the Getting There show. I really appreciate you taking the time, especially given you're on maternity. But I think our audience will have found that conversation really, really interesting, because we covered a lot of ground. So thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. Cheers. Cheers. Bye.